When you picture Mahatma Gandhi, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably a frail man in a loincloth, right? A symbol of peaceful resistance, the father of a nation. But what if I told you that the Gandhi we think we know was actually forged over 21 long, difficult years, in a place he never even intended to call home? We're going to dive into this often overlooked chapter, Gandhi's time in South Africa, the crucible that turned a young, ambitious lawyer into a revolutionary.
See, to really get the global icon, you have to meet the man he was before. And honestly, that man is almost unrecognizable. The Gandhi who showed up in South Africa was not some saint of nonviolence. He was a stretcher-bearer for the British Empire. He wasn't an anti-colonial icon yet. He was a loyal subject of the Queen Empress. And his views on race? Well, they were a far cry from the universal brotherhood we associate with him today. This is the story of that transformation.
So, let's set the scene. It's 1893. A young Mohandas Gandhi steps off a ship in Natal, South Africa. He's not there to start a movement, not at all. He's just a lawyer on a one-year contract. But he lands right in the middle of a cauldron of racial tension, a region torn apart by conflict between British colonials, the independent Dutch-descended Boer republics, and the recently conquered Zulu kingdom. It was a brutal, segregated world, and it was about to change him forever.
And this really gets to the core of his early ambition. It wasn't about independence. It wasn't about revolution. He genuinely believed in the British Empire. His whole goal was to prove that educated, so-called civilized Indians were worthy subjects who deserved the exact same rights as white British citizens. He wanted a seat at the imperial table, not to flip the whole thing over.
And you have to understand, this loyalty to the empire, it wasn't just for show. Gandhi's devotion to the British crown was deep. He saw it as a potential force for good, for enlightenment and justice in the world, and he desperately wanted Indians to be recognized as a valued part of it all.
Just listen to his own words from 1906. This perfectly captures his mindset. You hear that? He's not condemning the empire, he's praising it. He's appealing to its highest ideals, basically arguing that treating Indians unfairly is a betrayal of the very principles that made Britain great. He saw himself as a loyalist, just trying to call the empire back to its own supposed values.
And he put his actions where his mouth was. This number, over 1,100, that's the number of men Gandhi organized into the Indian Ambulance Corps during the Boer War. When Britain went to war, Gandhi saw an opportunity to prove Indian worth through service. He and his volunteers literally served as stretcher bearers, carrying wounded British soldiers off the battlefield.
So here's the crucial point. For Gandhi, this was all a political strategy. He figured if Indians were willing to bleed for the empire, how could the empire deny them their rights? He even did it again in 1906, organizing another volunteer corps during the brutal British suppression of the Bambatha Rebellion, a Zulu uprising. He was just so determined to show that Indians weren't just subjects, but valuable assets.
But this whole strategy of loyalty, well, it was about to slam headfirst into the hard wall of South African racism. To really get what he did next, you have to understand the society he was in. It wasn't just a simple black and white divide. It was this complex, messy hierarchy of British, Boers, Indians, and Native Africans, with every group fighting for its own position.
And this is probably one of the most difficult parts of Gandhi's South African story to grapple with. His pragmatic strategy was to argue for Indian rights by trying to elevate Indians above black Africans. He fought against being lumped together, even using the deeply offensive slurs of the time to argue that Indians, with their ancient civilization, deserved better. It was a political calculation, for sure, but one made in an incredibly desperate situation.
And to give you a sense of just how desperate that situation was, listen to this quote from his main adversary, Jan Smuts. The white settler government, they weren't interested in any subtle distinctions. To them, all non-whites were a threat. The anti-Indian feeling was just toxic, framing them as an Asiatic menace that needed to be literally cut out of the country. This was the kind of political poison Gandhi was up against.
So in the end, his strategy just didn't work. Despite all his passionate appeals and his acts of loyalty, the colonial government only tightened its grip. They passed more and more discriminatory laws that lumped Indians and Africans together, making it crystal clear that in this white man's world, there was just no room for non-white equality. His faith in British justice was beginning to shatter.
So what do you do when years of petitions, loyalty, and legal arguments all fail? When the system you believe in refuses to listen? Well, if you're Gandhi, you realize you need a new weapon. If he couldn't persuade the system from the inside, he would have to confront it from the outside. It was right there, in that moment of failure, that his greatest idea was born.
So, what was this new weapon? What exactly is satyagraha? Gandhi literally made up the word himself. It basically means holding firmly to truth. And here's the key. Satyagraha is not passive. It is an active, really powerful form of mass resistance. The core idea is that you challenge an unjust law non-violently and you willingly accept the punishment. You go to jail, you take the beatings to expose the brutality and the moral bankruptcy of the injustice itself. It's a way for the powerless to fight back by converting their opponent, not by crushing them.
And you know, this idea didn't just pop out of thin air. Gandhi was constantly reading, constantly observing. He was pulling together ideas from all over the world, from the Christian anarchism of Russia's Leo Tolstoy, the American transcendentalism of Thoreau. He even took inspiration from the defiant tactics of the British suffragettes he saw in London. He blended all of that with the ancient Indian principle of ahimsa, or non-harm, to create something totally new.
Okay, so he's got this powerful new theory of truth force. But theories are one thing. How does it actually work in the real world? Well, let's look at its first massive test, the Great March of 1913, which was one of the first and most dramatic acts of mass civil disobedience of the 20th century. Two key injustices basically lit the fuse. First, there was this crippling 3-pound tax on former indentured laborers. These were men and women who'd worked for years in conditions close to slavery and were now supposed to be free. And second, a court ruling that suddenly declared all Hindu, Muslim, and Parsi marriages invalid. Just imagine waking up one day and being told your wife is legally your mistress, your children are illegitimate. For the Indian community, especially the women, this was an attack on their honor they just could not accept.
And the response was absolutely electrifying. More than 20,000 indentured coal miners, sugar plantation workers, and other Indians just walked off the job. This wasn't a protest of lawyers and merchants anymore. This was a mass movement of the working poor. And Gandhi harnessed that energy, leading thousands on a great march across the Transvaal border, openly and peacefully breaking the law, knowing that the only way the state could respond was with mass arrests that would overwhelm the whole system and expose its injustice to the world.
And the state's reaction was swift, and it was brutal. The government literally turned private mine compounds into makeshift prisons to hold thousands of strikers. Marches were beaten, and on the sugar estates of Natal, when striking workers refused to give in, the police opened fire with live ammunition. This non-violent struggle had a very real and a very violent cost.
And that cost had names: Selvin, Guruvadu, Subriyan Gaundan, Pakyapan, Raghavan. These were the men shot and killed by police during that crackdown. They were the first martyrs of Satyagraha, ordinary working men who paid the ultimate price in this fight for basic dignity.
And the sacrifice came from every corner of the community. Valyama Mudaliar was just 16 years old when she joined the protest, got arrested, and was thrown in prison. She contracted a fatal fever in the horrible conditions and died shortly after being released. Her last words are reportedly, "Who would not love to die for one's country and one's religion?" It just shows the incredible courage of the women and even the teenagers who really formed the backbone of this movement. The Great March and the strikes sent shockwaves not just through South Africa, but across the entire British Empire. After 21 years of struggle, Gandhi's time in the country that had defined him was finally coming to an end.
So, was it a victory? Well, yes and no. The struggle ended in a hard-fought compromise. The government got rid of the hated 3-pound tax, and they passed a new law recognizing Indian marriages. And those were huge wins for the community. But that bigger dream Gandhi had arrived with, the dream of Indians being accepted as equal citizens of the British Empire, that was gone for good. He had learned that you can't just ask for justice from the powerful. You have to demand it.
And that brings us to the final, crucial question. The man who left South Africa in 1914 was not yet a saint. He was a brilliant, battle-hardened political strategist. He'd been a loyalist who became a rebel. He had used divisive racial arguments, and yet he had also led a multi-class mass movement. So how did this complex, often contradictory person become the simplified, spiritual Mahatma of global memory? Understanding the man who was forged in South Africa is the key to answering that question, and to seeing the real, complicated human being behind the legend.